So good evening. I'm Donna Schneider, president of the Prince George's County Historical Society, and welcome to tonight's Zoom history chat. We would appreciate it if you would mute yourselves. We are recording the chat and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel, which you can access through our website, www.pghistory.org. We will answer questions at the end of the chat, so please feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat box throughout the session, and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end. This month's chat is about the formation and legacy of Freedmen schools in Prince George's County from 1866 to 1870. Dr. Omar Price will join his society historian Susan Pearl for this conversation. They will discuss the history and significance of the Freedmen Bureau with details about the 11 schools that were constructed in Prince George's County after the Civil War, as well as some major new findings from the Freedmen Bureau records. So Susan, over to you and Omar.
Hello.
Mute. Thank you. Good evening. I'm really happy to be here tonight, especially to be talking with Omar Price, my friend and colleague, about his special study of the Freedmen's Bureau schools of Prince George's County. But I have to tell you how it got started. I was, as usual, on a Saturday afternoon, sitting and working in the Historical Society library in Greenbelt, and a young man walked into the library and we started talking. He introduced himself as Omar Price and told me that he was working on his doctorate in history at the Morgan State University. And he was required to fulfill an archival practicum the next semester. And he wondered if there was a project that he could help us with in our library to fulfill that archival practicum. Well, now, as it happened, I had just recently been asked to give a talk at the University of Maryland on Freedmen's Bureau schools. And I really needed some more information from the voluminous collection of Freedmen's Bureau papers. And so I asked Omar if he would be interested in working on that. He agreed, and he went right to work. And soon began to access just lots and lots of real and original materials from the Freedmen's Bureau collection, both at the National Archives and a lot that were online and available that had been digitized. And of course, at the same time, he was working full-time teaching history at the local high school. But about 2 years, once he got started on it, there was no stopping him. In fact, he came in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks later, and said that he was going to change his dissertation topic, which terrified me. I thought, what have I done to this nice young man? Anyway, he went right ahead, and in about 2 years, couple of years, he finished his dissertation, which is entitled Freedom, Faith, and Education, the Formation and Legacy of Freedmen Schools in Prince George's County, 1866 to 1870. He now has his doctorate. He went off for 2 years of experience in teaching history at a college level. He is now back, and I'm really delighted to have him here so that he can talk to you on this really fascinating subject, the Freedmen's Bureau schools of Prince George's County. So Omar, welcome back, first of all. And I hope you'll start by telling us just what the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was all about, when and how it got started, and the part of it, well, its purpose, I guess, principally, and the part of it that was so important to Prince George's County. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for having me. Even though I've given like many talks about the Freedmen's Bureau schools in Prince George's County several times, it's always a joy. It forces me to go back and reread, so things I wrote and things I put together, and it's like, oh, I don't remember this, and I look up more, and then I always find something new. So I'm always happy to do this. So thank you for having me once again. But the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, uh, most commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, uh, was a create was a brainchild of Republicans during the Civil War. Um, During the Civil War, uh, it was desired to create an agency that would help uh, newly freed African Americans transition from slavery to freedom. Also, oversee lands confiscated by Confederate officials, and you know, really like the literally help rebuild in the South for people who were displaced because of the Civil War. Um, it began in its official beginning is in 1865. However, it was a much smaller agency uh, in 1866. More people were, I mean, not more people, I'm sorry. I got to pop up here. Um, but in 1866, we begin to see kind of the organization that we think of when we think of the Freedmen's Bureau. The people who wanted it were a little disappointed because it didn't get its own agency, it didn't get its own line item or budget. It was created within the War Department. We used to have a War Department, now Department of Defense, but it was created under the War Department, and the kind of the tough part about it is that essentially it was like whatever the War Department allocated to them. They didn't have a specific amount that should a budget, um, but it did do quite a bit of work. Most of us know about the military districts in the deeper South. However, Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, it was a little different because these are slave-holding states that did not secede. So creating kind of military districts in these states would be seen by the population that supported the Union as a problem. So in Maryland, the Freedmen's Bureau had a much more narrow focus. Establish schools and try to settle disputes, and that's what brings us to the Freedmen's Bureau and how it worked in Maryland. However, I do want to say Maryland is kind of unique, even amongst the border states, because it is the only state that, through constitutional amendment and some federal meddling, as people then probably would have said, through constitutional amendment, abolished slavery in 1864 before the 13th Amendment, and established a state-run school system, and that state-run school system did not include the education of African American children. Susan?
Susan, you're on mute.
Yes, I just realized that. Sorry. Yes, so actually the district that that Prince George's County was within was, I think, Omar, it was all of Maryland, parts of Virginia, I think Alexandria and Fairfax, was it? Delaware and, I'm sorry?
Oh, so because so what they did was so they basically set up superintendents of education. So
Yeah.
every former Confederate state and former slave-owning state, for the most part, got a superintendent of education who kind of oversaw the construction operation of schools in that state. But given the area and given the fact that other than Virginia, you don't have Confederate states, but you have several slaveholding states. The superintendent of Washington D.C. becomes the superintendent of Washington D.C., Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, and Alexandria and Loudoun County, Virginia. And so that we end up with 3 different superintendents. Reverend General John Kimball. He's installed in 1866, and he actually pretty much does the most that the Freedmen's Bureau does in Maryland. He's from Massachusetts. He was a Union general, and in 1869, it was turned over to General Swaim. Swaim actually was head of the district in Vicksburg, Mississippi. He was head of Vicksburg. He was general head of the military district in Vicksburg, Mississippi, before he was brought to be superintendent. He was only superintendent in 1869 for a few months, and then it was turned over to Corporal Vanderlip, and Corporal Vanderlip basically saw it from the end of 1869 and is kind of transitioned out of Maryland in 1870.
Right. And thank goodness for John Kimball and the extensive correspondence that he has with a lot of the teachers. You will talk a little more, I'm sure, about the teachers' reports, the monthly teachers' reports. But in addition to that, we have so many letters that go back and forth between the people in the communities who wanted to start the schools, writing back and forth to Kimball, and then the teachers themselves expressing their problems and their successes in a rich collection of correspondence. So Kimball is probably the name you want to remember most, because I think most of the letters that go back and forth were either from or to him, and they give us a lot of information. So tell us, Omar, how, if a community wants to start a school and they want help from the Freedmen's Bureau, what happens? How do they go about it?
Okay, so and just going to what Susan said previously, all the schools of Prince George's County were established under John Kimball, under Reverend Kimball. The other superintendents were just kind of maintenance people, but establishment was under Reverend Kimball. So, essentially, what would happen is there would be a community that would write a letter, and we know that many people of color, particularly Black people, were not literate, so they had to either find a liaison who would write the letter, like correspondence for them, and we'll see a little bit later how that can be a little touch and go when you have somebody writing on your behalf. But the community, you get somebody write a letter saying we want a school, and what's also important is that we have the students to fill up the school. Because we find out later when teachers don't get paid, or like they think they're going to, that they have to have a certain amount of students to like justify being paid. And so that becomes really important. And something that we don't really, when we talk about that settling disputes, so apprenticeship becomes this terrible thing for Black children, where they can be contracted out. And this was not an uncommon thing, but what could happen to Black children was different than what could happen to white children. Like you can be contracted out, say you're going to work for this amount of time for this person. For white children, you knew where your child was, you knew who had that contract, and if that contract was going to get sold or they wanted to sell the contract to someone else, the parent had to approve and be notified. For Black children, that was not the case. Also, there was an effort to basically round up what they call abandoned children and orphan children. And what constituted being abandoned or neglected or orphaned was very liberal at the time. Like, so if you went to a field somewhere and were working and you had children at home, like they might get taken. And those contracts can be sold anywhere in the state without the parent's knowledge, consent, anything. So a big thing was to combat this apprenticeship system, so you actually had students to go to these schools. Most of the schools were tied to church congregations, because what better way to say we can guarantee you we have these students or enough students than having communities that already met as a church. The schools often, they became the school, the church, often became the meeting house of like kind of, it was like the one-stop shop. So so the community requested a school. Reverend Kimball and the Bureau would come and, they would send letters and they would ask some questions, make sure it could happen. The Bureau would provide the money for the materials for the school, but then the community would have to build the school themselves. So the community would still have to build the school, and then once the school was constructed, they would let the superintendent know and say they are ready for a teacher. Finding a teacher was complicated, to say the least, in a lot of places, because of local sentiments towards Black education, and just being able to find somebody at given times was complicated. So oftentimes what happened or what I should say, what was most common, is the superintendent will contact a charitable organization in the north or in Baltimore, because Baltimore had one of those charitable organizations, and then they would send a teacher to the school and they would pay the teacher's salary. Now, the community had to be able to pay for the room and board of the teacher, and that became an issue a lot of places, because we are largely talking about relatively poor people, even for the time, like really poor. So it's hard to be able to board another person, particularly hard if that was a white teacher, because white teachers couldn't be bored with Black families. And so being able to find a place to board a white teacher became an extra problem. But fundamentally, the communities wanted black teachers. That was actually that was stated several times and really important. They wanted black teachers, uh, and some of the organizations they used northern and pre Civil War HBCUs, and we know there wasn't that many pre Civil War HBCUs, but like Lincoln University to try to get teachers placed.
Okay, well, you took my next question away from me, but
Oh.
that's fine. No, that's good. So the Bureau would pay for and ship to the community the lumber and supplies for building, and the community would work together to build it. And then when it was ready, and they were looking for a teacher, the Bureau, Reverend Kimball actually, would send out questions to a list of Northern charities that were accustomed to supporting this sort of thing. Can you tell us just a little about some of those charities, where they were and how they figured in the placing of teachers in the Freedmen's Bureau schools?
So there was actually a lot of charities, uh, and like that kind of started before the end of the Civil War. You know, they would send people down in places that were captured by Union soldiers and try to get things started there. But excuse me. Uh, but the charities that specifically you find in Maryland and in Prince George's County, uh, where teachers came from, because there's a difference between charities that contributed to the well-being of schools and who paid for teachers. So you have the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, the New York National Freedmen's Relief Association, the Baltimore Association for the Moral Educational Improvement of Colored People, the Pennsylvania Relief Association, and those associations and some more combined in 1866 as the American Freedmen and Union Commission, Freedmen's and Union Commission. And the reason why they combined it is to try to not be redundant and try to be more efficient in how it allocated funds. And, you know, you don't want to step on people's toes in different places. So they kind of work together. In Prince George County, in supporting the schools, you also have the Presbyterian Committee of Missions, which was a combination of two different Presbyterian societies. But those, for Prince George County, those were the principal actors to find teachers and support some of the like after the school was built, like make sure some of the upkeep was done and rent was paid if rent needed to be paid.
Okay, so the Bureau paid for the lumber and supplies for building. The community had to identify the location and start buying it, at least start. And they also had to provide a place for the teacher to stay. And the charities, we'll call them, paid the salaries of the teachers. Okay. So probably the best thing we can do now is look at a few specific examples. There are some absolutely marvelous examples among these 11 schools in Prince George's County. I'm going to try an experiment. If it doesn't work, we'll just go back. Oh wait, now I have to do it. Well, no, wait a minute. 1 second.
So while Susan look for that, behind me, this picture is
Oh, good.
actual is is one of two remaining Freedmen schools in the state of Maryland. Unfortunately, none of the ones in Prince George County still remain today. This school, the Hosanna School, is because it's still there in Hartford County, Maryland. They've turned it into a museum. So, because oftentimes if you just Google like Freedmen School, there's a single picture that comes up very often, and I don't know where that school is, and I often use it just kind of just giving people an idea, but for the most part, these are one-room schoolhouses, and teachers and community, because things that we take for granted today, as in like textbooks, all the things that go into, making a school work, chalkboards and things. So the teacher would have to use their money to buy these things and then sell them to the students. And the students had to buy, and that's how, and if you couldn't sell them, the teacher just was out of that money. So there were a whole lot of moving parts. Some of these schools, not literally, but this is duct tape. We putting this together, trying to make stuff work, because there was a lot of challenges. So
now, do you see this?
yes.
Yes. Okay. Just very quickly, this is the 1861 map of Prince George's County, and I have put the 11 locations. The red dots are the 11 locations. Muirkirk, Bladensburg here as we go down along the west side, Oxen Run and Broad Creek and Chapel Hill, Forestville and Rubytown, Upper Marlboro, coming down the east side now, Upper Marlboro, Nottingham, Horsehead, and Woodville. That just gives you an idea of the layout. And you'll notice, of course, right away that the concentration is in the south. There are probably a lot of reasons for that we don't know for sure. Okay, let's go back now to and start looking through a few of those schools. You want to start with Muirkirk, Omar?
Okay, that works. So all the schools were constructed and began operation between 1866 and 1868. There were only three schools that were in operation before 1868. That's the Muirkirk, the Blairsburg, and the Oxen. It was called Oxen Run, but in Oxen Hill. Those are only three, and there are various reasons why those were the first three. So the first one, Muirkirk, the oldest one, and it was founded in April 1866. If you are familiar with the old Muirkirk iron mill or iron work, that's what it's called, and was it Charles Coffin? And Charles Coffin, so there was a school for the children of the workers. It already existed, and there was a local school for white children, and that school closed, and those white children came to the one Coffin built or had built. I'm sure he did not build it himself, but had built. And so for a very long time, this was very interesting to me because is the only school that records having white and black children. And that was something that was different than every other school. What I found out during the letter from the teacher, and it did have the most stable teacher. Phineas Whitehouse, he was there the entire time. But what we find is that the white students went to school in the morning, the black children went to school in the afternoon, and they held a night and Phineas held a night school for black adults to go to school that evening, um, and it became a relatively easy thing for the Freedmen Bureau to operate because the school was already there. It was already a built-in student population, and so you didn't end up running into some of the problems that we'll probably see in the next school we talk about. It was a relatively uneventful school. And I say that because most of the schools were not uneventful. And, they had a plethora of challenges, and you just don't have them in Merkirk because they already had a built-in population.
And they had a teacher with a wonderful, memorable name, Phineas Whitehouse. I love it. He was from New Hampshire.
Yes.
Was he supported by the New England
yes,
Association? Okay.
Supported by New England Society. And so one of the fun or not so fun things that you, when doing this research, is you'll, like, every month, each teacher in every school submitted a teacher report, a monthly teacher report. And you find that teachers get way more expansive in their explanations, like in letters, than they will write on teacher reports. I don't know if, like, teacher reports were filtered through certain people and they didn't feel safe to say things. But when you look at letters written to the Freedmen Bureau or letters written to the charitable organizations, you find a lot more about the school. Even some of the information doesn't always align. Like, so, cross-referencing that, and you find that it's a lot going on in a lot of these schools, except kind of Merkirk, which was relatively peaceful.
And Phineas wrote wonderful letters back to New England. So as you say, they don't always align with the monthly reports, but they are full of very interesting material. And that leads us to Blairsburg, where we had another remarkable teacher, a Quaker lady from Philadelphia named Sally Cadwallader. I don't know whether she was part of the very prominent Cadwallader family of Philadelphia. She must have been in some way, but she was an activist, a passionate activist, and her activism got her in trouble sometimes. So tell us about Sally Cadwallader of Blairsburg.
Quickly, and we talked about how I just talked about how Merkirk was pretty uneventful. Blairsburg is the beginning of things not being uneventful. Blairsburg also, I started operation in 1866. It was built on. There was already a structure on land, and basically that structure was rented to the Bureau to allow for the school, allegedly, because the owner of the land very quickly was like, I thought it was going to be a church, don't want a school for black people on my land. And so very quickly the school, Blairsburg, had to find a new location and build a new school. That new building opened October of 1867. So and Blairsburg does not have the consistency of a teacher that Merkirk had, but Sally Cadwallader by far is the most she might not be the most active writer of letters, but her involvement, she had already been a teacher and was removed from her original post because she would file reports on freedmen officers who misuse funds and would, you know, take funds from the school and take supplies, and so she would report them, and basically she got labeled as a troublemaker. So they took her out of her original post. She asked to be placed again, and they brought her to she came to Blairsburg, and I think who she was and who the community's natural distrust of like too good to be true white people, you know, created some conflict. Like she got involved with labor disputes. She argued that the reason why black laborers were treated so poorly is because there were so many of them, and her and basically she was like, if there was greater scarcity of workers, then, you know, employers would have to treat the workers that they had a little bit better. And so she arranged for 35 black men and their families to be to get board in homes in Philadelphia and to just leave and go to Philadelphia to try to thin out the labor pool. It's one of those things that we can sit here now and read letters and we can say, wow, that's a lot right there. And it was, I'm sure it was a lot even then. Everybody wasn't buying it. And you have letters from local black people who said that, yeah, basically we don't trust it. Unfortunately, we don't have the record of what kind of what did 35 go, how many went, you took her open offer, and what was the circumstance of that. But she appeared very committed to the school. She ends up getting married and going back to Philadelphia, but she got married in the school. She sends a letter that says that there's an orphan black girl, and she asks Reverend Kimball, can she take the black girl with her when she goes back to Philadelphia? Unfortunately, we don't have a response, so we don't know if she took the young girl with her. But she seemed very adamant at you know, getting involved to making things as fair as possible, and combating some of the challenges that many of the schools faced.
I was gonna say, can I just interrupt? Can Susan or Omar put in the chat the spelling of Sally's last name, please?
Okay, you're going to do that?
Yeah.
Well, I just remind people that, as you said, she finished her exams in December of, was it 69? Yeah. And then got married, well, made arrangements to get married in the schoolhouse with all her students there, with a big party with gifts and food for all the students. And she asked Superintendent Kimball to marry them. Now, whether that actually happened, we're not sure, because her parents really wanted her to be married in a Quaker service in Philadelphia. But in any case, she spent a lot of time putting that together. Now, on Saturday, Omar and I were sitting in the library wishing we knew more about Sally Cadwallader. Did you ever find out whom she married, Omar?
No.
Well, I somehow struck something lucky this afternoon, a couple of hours before this started. And I want, it's a surprise for you, Omar, and I hope this works. I'm going to try to share my screen. Do you see anything?
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow, that's what I said. 1868, Sally Cadwallader Eli. In that December of 69, no, 68, I guess it was. Mm-hmm. She married Samuel Cadwallader. And what I found out, you can still hear me, can't you?
Yes.
Yeah. She and Samuel Eli had both been teachers at the contraband camp Rucker in Virginia in 1864. And the inspector who went checking the schools there said that the children were exceedingly attached to their teacher, Sally Cadwallader. And he was teaching also. This was the camp of abandoned lands, plantations that had been abandoned, that the Army set up, bringing in the freed Blacks who had no support, and put them to work raising crops for the Army. And they set up schools for the children. So that obviously is either Sally and Samuel met while they were both teaching at Fort Rucker, or maybe they were both probably Quakers. Maybe they had both come from Philadelphia. That I don't know. But there's Sally at the time of her wedding, and it's just exciting to know a little bit more about her. And now let me see if I can get back here.
Well, I just want to say that is an amazing tree, because
I just was so excited. My poor husband had to leave the house.
Several days, and even last Saturday trying to track her down.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anything about her after she married and went back to Philadelphia, but at least we know what she was doing before she came to Blairsburg. Okay, I had to do that. Sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you, but I had to do it.
Awesome.
You want to go to another school? Which one would you like to talk about now?
Let's go with Upper Marlboro.
Oh, good.
So Upper Marlboro, like, this is the first four-way, and kind of going south in Prince George's County, and this is the first school that we end up with a lot of problems, like from even trying to start the school. So I talked about earlier how you have local people who act as liaisons for communities and just for the Freedmen's Bureau to kind of know what's the local tenor is like. So in Upper Marlboro, they had an entire meeting of, like, the white citizens had a meeting basically to determine whether they were going to allow a black school to be built. And Susan, can you give me the lawyer's name? Because I want to say it started with a C. But he writes a letter to, it was a local lawyer, writes a letter to to Reverend Kimball, and is very clear: do not send a white teacher here. Like, the people are up in arms, and they are ready about a black school, and they will not tolerate a white teacher teaching black children, and that becomes a bit of contention. So you end up getting John B. Douglas. He's a native of Baltimore. He's sent to come teach school. We know that getting paid becomes so getting paid isn't the issue. The issue is having some place to cash a check. And places would not cash check of the teacher who taught black students. And so we know through letters that he got his paycheck sent to his mother in Baltimore. And unfortunately, John Douglas ends on a kind of a cliffhanger. Like, he sends a letter to Reverend Kimball saying that he had been assaulted by two men, and asked what the Bureau was going to do to protect him and, everything. And not to say that there was no response, but we don't have a response. And what we do have is when it's time for the school to reopen, they say they don't know where the teacher is. They don't know what happened to the teacher. They don't have a teacher. And eventually they have to get a new teacher. And we don't know what happened to John Douglas. And, hopefully he just left if he didn't get a satisfactory response. And at least I hope that, like, something more serious didn't happen to him. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that these teachers did risk a lot by doing this. Even in Maryland, even in a state where, it didn't secede from the Union, during research for this, looking at some of the reports of the charitable organizations, they would have a report of how many teachers died, on duty. And it was not an expansive list, but teachers were killed, and that was real. And Douglas John was not the only person or the only teacher in Prince George's County to experience some type of retaliation. Or there was actually even a line on the teacher report that said local sentiments toward the school. And like I said, most letters were more expansive. They explained a lot more than what the people would say on the reports, but some of the reports were pretty consistently damning of, like, the local people were not in favor of a black school near them.
So you want to, yeah, it was shocking to me to read the letter from Shelby Clark, and I'm sorry, I was muted. I was trying to tell you Shelby Clark.
Shelby Clark.
Many of us know him as one of the prominent lawyers in town, but he writes an impassioned letter to Kilmer. Now I can't remember John Kimball's, telling him, no, we can't have a white teacher here. It's just not going to work for a white teacher to teach black kids. So we have the opposite, well, not the opposite, but a reverse sort of situation in Rubytown. Do you want to talk about that? Or did you have another one you wanted to?
Oh, no, we can jump to Rubytown.
Okay.
Rubytown. Probably.
Do they know where Rubytown is?
Oh.
It's Clinton nowadays. Rubytown, then it was called Surrattsville. That's where the Mary Surratt house is. Now it's Clinton.
And Rubytown has a lot of, it's a very interesting situation. And it's really interesting because of TB Roby. So, oddly enough, so what I just found, he was initially a pro-Confederate soldier, and he ends up being a justice of the peace in Rubytown. And he is the most, I don't know what his real intentions were, person out of all of this, because he's the one that requests a school, but it also seems like he might have saw it as a way for him to make some money. So it becomes this huge ordeal. So when we talked about the Freedmen Bureau would give the funds to support to build a school. Well, the Freedmen Bureau would give most of the funds to build a school, and communities would have to contribute some themselves. Show they had a level of investment, right? Um, so basically, the idea was the community would pay half, the bureau would pay the other half, school would get built. That works. So Roby, who was acting at this point, I don't actually know if he's acting as liaison for the community or he is just acting upon for himself. But he makes this a very difficult process. He makes this a difficult process. He fronts the money, or allegedly fronts some of the money for the school to be constructed. The school is constructed. It goes over budget. Uh, Allegedly, it is over budget, and the bureau is like, we don't pay that much for the schools. It did not meet the dimensions that the bureau like request or says that the school should be, and it is slightly bigger. It's a slightly bigger school, and the bureau's like, yeah, that's not what we agreed upon. That's not what we pay for. So then it becomes this thing between Roby and the community. The community says that they won't pay extra money or pay Roby back for money he fronted until they can use the building. He says they can't use the building for anything until he gets his money. He tells Reverend Kimball how much he has sacrificed to build this school and how he has become this pariah and people want to take away his justice of peace duties. And so it becomes this whole ordeal. Reverend Kimball is trying to mediate. He says, why don't you let them meet? Maybe not for the school, but let them have meetings in the building, so then they will pay the money. They go back and forth, and eventually the bureau just antes up the rest of the money, and they come together for it. And then and they finally get a teacher. So now you get a second person who is communicating with the bureau, and this is how you really see that Roby might not be the most trustworthy of narrators of what's going on. The local people vote for a board to go over the school, for being over the school, a board of trustees. There we go. And so Roby writes a scathing letter about some of the board members that were voted on, that they are just going to gamble and drink and play cards in the building, and they aren't good men. He wants his brother to be one of the board members, and he eventually creates his own board and of people to be over the school, basically saying that people aren't trustworthy, and it becomes a whole back and forth. And fortunately, many of the letters have been saved to now, and you get to really see how this plays out, and you get to see the personality of the teacher, and kind of the situation going on. And so Roby, like the founding and operation of Rubytown, the Rubytown school, is by far the most eventful in terms of just getting off the ground, because it was like the only one where you have an outside person who had a lot to do with the school's operation and of what kind of going on.
Well, thank you for this great conversation. I'm sorry to have to put a break to it. It's been great. Thank you, Omar and Susan. We have one question, and I actually have a question too for you. Susan, where did you find the photo of Sally?
I just spelled her name funny and it came up. So there are two portraits at the Library of Congress of Sally and her husband, Samuel Eli. And then I found a lot more information about Fort Rucker because I read just in the caption of the photograph that they had both taught at Camp Rucker. So yeah, there's a lot more. I think that might make another article for the news and the Historical Society newsletter.
Great. So another question just popped up from Doug Bowles. He asked, do we know the location of the Blairsburg school? And maybe we could put a historical marker there if we do.
Do you, I don't know exactly. We know where the next school was, and it's possible that the first school was on that same site. Do you know any more than that?
We don't. I know the last, so Blairsburg School went through a lot of name changes, and the last name of the school is Macedonia, and I tried to trace that, and as a church congregation, and it has led to a lot of inconclusive results.
Well, I think that it was on the north side of what is now 450, about where the overpass is for Kenilworth Avenue, or a little bit farther west in that area, which was called Macedonia or Dent Chapel, is the most likely place, and it would have been very closely associated with the chapel. But we don't know that absolutely for sure. We tried to look up the Mr. Duffy, the Irishman who rented a lot to the community and then pulled back on it. And he's a hard one to follow, but yeah, we'll track it down one of these days.
Okay, my question is, when did the Freedmen Bureau schools stop being used in the county?
So that is an awesome question, because what we find is that the Bureau pulls out of Maryland kind of in for the most part in 1870. But the state doesn't take over the education of black students until 1872. So there's kind of this gray area. There are some schools in Eastern Shore, the southern, and some of the southern counties that they have some record up until 1872, but the entire rest of the state is kind of like it goes dark for 2 years. And what we do know is that in 1872, some of the schools still existed, and we know that some of them don't get a new building until the 1920s, where Rosenwald schools were built to replace them, and so kind of without a lot of aid, had to just keep operating at the best of their abilities.
Well, the Bureau existed until 72, right?
Yes.
They just pulled out of Maryland sort of halfway through 1870. The schools were still going until the summer of 1870. I'm just guessing that they continued somehow, because the first listing we get of the schools for Black children by the county commissioners of schools in 1872 lists 13 schools. The 11 that we already know about, and we do know that they are those same schools, and two more, one in the Brandywine area and one finally in the Northeast, in what is now, was then District 7, Queen Anne area. And I think it was the school in Collington that is first listed because of the name of one of the trustees. But it would have been about the same time, almost the same time as the Queen Anne School at Mount Nebo. where the teacher that we know most about, I think, William Lane Watkins, came to teach in 1876. So in 1872, we have 13 schools for Blacks, and then they continue building slowly, but so that there are more and more by the end of the 19th century.
And just so, like, there is evidence that the Freedmen Bureau schools, it wasn't, these are the only schools that Black students had. These were the schools that were associated with the Freedmen's Bureau. And it has not been the easiest of jobs to find out, like, what schools existed and how they existed. We know that there were people teaching Black children even before, the end of the Civil War. So we know it happened. It's just, so some of these schools may have been a byproduct of that after 1870.
And they were almost all, or I would say all, associated with churches.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you, Omar and Susan, again for a great chat this evening. Our next history chat is going to be Monday, October 25th, when Stacy Hawkins will chat with Dr. Julia Rose, the director of the Marietta House Museum, about the Giving Voice Initiative. That will actually be our last history chat for the year, and we will be back on Monday, January 24th, 2022, for a chat with Dr. Richard Bell on his book, Stolen. I'm sure a lot of you know, this society is run by volunteers and is dependent on membership and donations to support our programming, such as the history chat tonight. If you enjoyed the programming, and we do not, I should also state, we don't receive any county or state funding. So if you have enjoyed tonight's chat, we would appreciate it if you would consider becoming a member or making a donation. And both options you can do through our website, www.pghistory.org. And finally, which I know Susan is waiting for me to say, is that we have some very exciting news to share with everybody. Our Frederick DeMar Library of County History can now reopen and we will reopen our doors to the public on this coming Saturday, October 2nd. But we do have new hours. We are now going to be open from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. But we also do offer appointments when possible. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you next month. Good night.
Thank you
for having me.
Good night.
Good night.